Hey everyone. Thanks for joining us, Brendan. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Um, yeah, I've been really amazed at how prolific you are in your work. I feel like I've been, looking up. I mean, I've known about you for a long time now. And you have like a blog and a Substack and a podcast and a YouTube channel, and you're a part of various different projects. And you have books, 4 or 5 books on various different topics, from Metamodernism to Christianity and meaning. And yeah, it's just like really cool for me topics that you're lots of topics you're interested in, and lots of writing and work to absorb. And yeah, there's these different projects you're a part of as well. Like we talked to Corey Barker recently in the Archdisciplinarity research group, and that's got your name on it too. And there's the Institute of Applied Metatheory that's also got your name on it. And then you have your own Sky Meadow Institute, where you do things like retreats, and there's like an organic garden. It looks stunning. It looks absolutely beautiful. Is that where you are now?
Yep, Sky Meadow. Yep.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. So it's like, wow, this guy's doing a lot, and I'm like, where do you find the time to do all this stuff?
Yeah. If you've ever seen the movie The Prestige with Gene Hack, or no, I was going to say Gene Hackman. It was with who does that guy?
Christian Bale and Hugh Jackman.
Hugh Jackman, that's who it is. That's all I have to say to that question. No, I do feel very much at the moment that there's a lot to do, and I keep saying to myself, got to make hay while the sun shines. There's just sort of been a confluence of factors that I feel like I'm called to do a bunch of things at the moment, and I'm more or less able to kind of keep up with what I'm able to keep up with, and until I can't do that anymore, I'm going to keep doing it. And
excellent.
That's it. But there's a lot in the mix for sure.
And you just recently announced the Meaning Lab. Can you tell us a bit more about what that is?
Yeah, that's an exploratory thing, and I hope it comes together. The basic idea is I see this sort of like paradigm emerging, and it's probably more than emerging at this point. It's probably been around in various forms for a little bit, but it's this notion of the Meaning Lab is trying to set up here at Sky Meadow Institute like a dedicated sort of research hub to like meaning studies and the scientific study of meaning in various ways. And so in the context of a set of methodological and sort of theoretical conceptions about what that means. And so there's a number of theories or meta theories that approach the topic in very kind of convergent ways that I see as being very much at sort of the cutting edge. And I foresee the possibility of trying to just cohere people working in that way, in that space, and trying to have sort of a dedicated context for people to present their work and present their findings, engage in symposia, maybe get some research funding to help the projects that they're working on. But yeah, some way in which, a lot of the work that's being done that is sort of disparate and maybe not necessarily self-aware that it's kind of part of a broader paradigm, trying to be more concerted about that and bring that together. So I did a podcast with Anna Riedel, and she's now part of Sky Meadow Institute, and she's been plugged in very much to kind of the neurocognitive science element of this. And so I think going forward, it's an exciting prospect to try to bring in a bunch of scholars exploring that topic from this particular perspective, and see what comes from it. So at the same time, a lot of the way that I work, per your first question, is I'll just sort of like, I iterate a lot and I try and I see what's possible, right? And so sometimes things aren't possible, but you don't know if you don't try. So the Meaning Lab seems like it would be a good thing, and I hope it can happen and come together and get the resources and everything. But if it doesn't, then I'll move on to the next thing and I'll try the next thing. So
is it kind of like you're announcing something before it's happened, like kind of to see how it lands?
Well, it's an announcement to try to get awareness and for this effort, right? But then
Mm.
it's sort of like you hope that if you build it, they will come, sort of a thing,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And so in some ways, the Meaning Lab could be its own thing in any number of versions. The version I would like to see, though, is, you know, if you could get some people who appreciate the value of this kind of inquiry, who could bring some funding to this, and then you could start to have a kind of momentum and a kind of a more, you know, better resourced kind of approach. That would be ideal. Lacking that, we can certainly, you know, bring in speakers and scholars and do various kinds of things, but a lot of that's kind of contingent on who sees the value of something and says, I want to support this. So that was why when I put that out, it was sort of a, you know, calling all people who might be interested in this and philanthropists and so on. This is a project, but yeah, you gotta, you know, the whole context and sense for a lot of the work that I do is sort of universal selection theory, right? Which is variation and selective retention, right? So it's just like continual iteration, and whatever works gets selected for and gets carried forward, and whatever doesn't work just dies, and then you try a new version. So I do that a lot with these projects that I work on. Is I kind of explore the possibility space and hope that something sticks when you throw it at the wall. And I think that this one has a lot of legs to it. So I think that something really cool could come from that. But
Amazing.
but it's still early days, so we'll see. So hopefully that comes together.
Yes, I really see a lot of this from you, especially around Sky Meadow Institute, is this experimental kind of, well, inviting people into something experimental and being like, cool, let's explore together, let's figure this out. Like you've got these metamodern spirituality kind of practice labs, or it kind of feel like they've got this experimental feel to them as well. And
yeah, we started calling those labs. That was Layman's idea, and I think that that's the right kind of framing for it, because, you know, a lot of what we're interested in is at this sort of emergent cutting edge of things, right? And so you don't necessarily want to preclude that we have that answer or that we know what that is exactly. It's much more exciting and real, and I think to the point where you invite people to share what they're doing,
right,
and almost more like, you know, I think of like the emergence of the Royal Society, right, which is at the early point in the Enlightenment period. You know, that was like one of the first organizations ever to actually like have a bunch of folks doing science, reading each other's papers, peer review, all this stuff, right? And there was a sense in which people were co-exploring something together. It was sort of an invitation to do a certain kind of process with each other. And I think that we're in a kind of similar moment, whether that's a new renaissance or this new emerging paradigm, metamodernism, all the, you know, doesn't really matter what we call it, but there's something showing up that's new and different, and it's kind of it's kind of this next thing. And I think that it's a similar kind of dynamic. Then it's sort of like, what is this? It's a kind of open inquiry, and kind of share that with people. It's sort of a exploratory, experimental kind of vibe.
So you're kind of inviting people in to co-create with you and build community, and it's like, this is not my thing. I'm just a catalyst here, kind of with an idea, and you come in and, you know, let's make it together.
Yeah, it's bigger than all of us, and so it is what we collectively can realize of it, right? And so I think things tend to ossify and go cold and die if it ever, one, kind of becomes one person's thing or one group's thing, or two, if one person or one group or something, however insightful, thinks that they've got the whole answer, right? So you've got to keep that openness and that fluidity, that kind of just amount of chaos and complexity, you know, foam in there, so that whatever you haven't accounted for yet can kind of come out. And I think that that's sort of sensibility-wise really important for the kinds of things that I'm interested in and the kinds of projects I'm a part of.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of curious about asking kind of why you're doing all these things. Like, what is the thing that is really you're trying to meet, or that you're trying to, you know, tackle in the world?
Yeah. I couldn't think of anything better, so I figured why not. There's a lot of different ways I could go at that question. I think probably based on some of the things we'll get into, I can go a little bit more esoteric than in other contexts. So the so what in that mode would be something like, I think that an emerging sense of God or the divine is taking shape in society as it always has historically, and that calls forth a kind of participatory gesture, that's not something you can just sit back and watch. Like, it doesn't happen unless you get involved and participate in it happening. And through kind of just the unfolding of my own life trajectory, I started to realize the importance of that as a phenomenon, and then starting to realize that it is happening in some really important and profound way. So in that kind of esoteric framing of it, I would say something like, the most important thing I think any human being can do is rise to a certain kind of calling, a vocation, whereby you are of service to the divine by helping the divine realize and manifest itself in a novel, creative way that has never occurred before, and to, in a sense, be of service to that emergent potential of the next thing in the emergence of the sacred. So that would be sort of the kind of sacramental or kind of like religious languaging for that at that level. But then there are much more kind of secular, mundane ways of speaking about this, right? I mean, you could step back and say, I think that we need a paradigm shift, in our forms of knowledge and the way that we make sense of the world. I think that's urgently needed. And I think when we look out at the world, we see a very broken, crazy, chaotic place that seems to be going in many ways in the wrong direction. And so I think that calls forth a sense of like, I need to do something. I need to do whatever I can. And I think that a big part of that is just that our ways of seeing the world and our ways of thinking about things is no longer, it doesn't make the cut when it comes to the level of complexity that now we're facing. So I see that as being another way of thinking about what we need to be doing and what I'm interested to help, help bring about. And I guess, one final way of framing it, which is somewhere maybe between the esoteric and the more kind of just mundane, paradigmatic ways of thinking about things, is like, I do like John Vervaeke's framing of this meaning crisis, and that's something that I've experienced. And meaning and how we make meaning and what meaning is and all of that has become really the focus of my life's work. And so I feel a kind of calling to do what I can to contribute to our engagement with that topic, right? And to not just at an intellectual level, but at a really deep, visceral, felt, embodied, existential level, right? If people are suffering, if people are engaged in this collective meaning crisis and experiencing, diseases of despair and this sort of a thing, right? Like, that's real, and I can phenomenologically relate to a lot of that as well. And then I feel a sense that, is there anything I can do to help people with that process? And I feel like over the course of my life, relatively short as it's been, I've come to some realizations along the way. And I feel like I would have really loved to have known this 10, 15, 20 years ago. So there's a desire to want to kind of share that and articulate it. So meaning, paradigm shift, bringing God into the world in a new form. Those are all kind of my jam.
Yeah, I love it. I love that you brought all three of those as well, because I was thinking that it'd be possible that you could just talk about the meaning crisis. That's the way I've heard a lot of people talking about this recently. But it sounds like you're almost like, the way that I'm interpreting some of what you're saying, and that I bring it into my own. Well, I have just come back from a festival that's all around how do we deal with the meaning crisis? How do we support each other to create, like, in the same way, create community? We're building this together. And how do we, part of answering the question is, and I think integral theory and metamodernism offer some of this knowledge as well. It's kind of like this embodied epistemology. It's kind of like, I've got these different ways of taking in information, and how can I find even more ways of taking information, or how can and interpreting that information and making meaning out of that, especially with your description of listening to something bigger than yourself and being kind of a catalyst for those forces, and like knowing that in order to truly express those forces in the world, you yourself have to be a good vehicle for that, and that requires various different kinds of personal work as well. yeah, really cool to hear you talk about it in those different ways.
Yeah,
and yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more about how you feel metamodernism explicitly kind of offers to those different positions.
Yeah, and maybe just to add a little bit of framing there, because I love what you like, the explanation you gave. It really resonated with me in terms of the calling, speaking about feeling called, to be of service and to participate in the unfolding and the realization, I guess, of that transcendent, or all of that really speaks to me and resonates with my experience. But also, I also am left feeling like conceptually I'm still not I still don't fully understand like what is, because part of what I kind of understood the question that Alexander was asking is kind of like, how would you relate, I guess, your project, as a philosopher, as a thinker, and I guess like because the general stuff about participatory, a way of existing and the vocation, all of that makes sense to me. But how does metamodernism in particular like speak to and serve as a vehicle for that?
Yeah, I think it sounds like you and your audiences will be familiar with that integral framing as well, and so there's a lot of overlap there in a similar way, which I think carries over. I came into this line of inquiry apart from my own kind of existential crises and grappling with issues of meaning in that way, but actually really as a direct result of that, through the question of what is this postmodern world that we're supposedly living in. I mean, this would have been back in 2010, 2011. I looked around and I felt like that there was a cultural version of what I was experiencing individually, that there was some way in which this death of God experience, this loss of meaning, and this loss of religion, spirituality that I underwent, in my early 20s, let's say, had a collective version. And again, this was before I, discovered any of these really helpful models later on about this stuff. It just seemed like, oh yeah, well, when we look back at what we've been through, in a sense, world historically, I guess you could say, that there's been some kind of a progression from this worldview of, just a rich fullness of meaning everywhere to this sort of disenchanted existence. And Charles Taylor, for example, in The Secular Age, or there's a great book I've got called God's Funeral, maps this historically really well. It's a simple story and in some ways can be overdone, right? And even people I'm very close with and whose work I really admire a lot, like Jason Storm, I think would challenge aspects of this story. But I think the basic version of it, I feel very confident has some real merit to it, which is that collectively, you compare the modern worldview and its kind of materialistic, reductionistic, atheistic, deterministic orientation to reality, to a, let's say, I don't know, high medieval Dantean kind of neo-Aristotelian, Neoplatonic. The world is full of levels of being that rise up to ultimate reality, that is ultimate bliss and insight and wisdom and all this stuff. Like, that's a profound break. And even though my brand of religiosity that I, grew up in and left was not necessarily that, it was more specifically a kind of like evangelical Christianity, there was still a sense that in that worldview, things were meaningful and they were rich and they had significance and this sort of a thing. And in this period of modernity, we'd sort of lost something like that. This disenchantment had happened. And so that was sort of the context for my understanding of a lot of this stuff as I tried to make sense of it myself. And then I tried to kind of do a investigatorial, like who done it, right? Like, how did this happen? Who killed God, so to speak, right? And then it becomes a sort of historical question of like, how do you trace this unfolding in history? And so the connection I guess I'm trying to make is that I think that there is a real parallel or analog or isomorphism between that individual experience of a meaning crisis, and historioculturally, where whole groups of people have moved and shifted in their worldview from one structure to another, with attendant consequences. And so for me, the question then was sort of, okay, interesting. At the collective level, how do we understand this? This is some kind of move from a pre-modern kind of religious orientation to reality, however we want to conceive of that, into a modern sort of disenchanted, kind of mechanistic worldview. And then onward still, right? Because then you get postmodernity, and you get a kind of radicalization of some of those ideas and a negation of them in others, but a whole new level of disillusionment and deconstruction and that sort of thing, right? And so, yeah, for me, the question became in some ways historicized, and I was interested in it from that angle. So metamodernism came on my radar as a result of that project. It was sort of people exploring what comes after postmodernism. And this was, mind you, before Hansi Freinacht. This was early cultural studies metamodernism. And what I found in the people talking about metamodernism was a worldview that was much more of the sort that I would hope to see emerging beyond postmodernism, right? It probably wouldn't have resonated with me the way other theories do, like or that have been proposed, like hypermodernism, digimodernism, these kinds of other things that are sort of like, no, things just keep going and they get more extreme, and more detachment from reality, and it's like, okay, that's an interesting theory. But with metamodernism, there actually seemed to be something rather hopeful in here, because there was a marked kind of return of engagements with grand narratological thinking, meaning, myth, but in a very nuanced way that carried forward the insights of postmodernism and therefore wasn't reactionary. And so all of that was really, it spoke to me about what this move could look like. And it also just, resonated with my own initial attempts to do that. So I think that the project that I'm engaged in as being situated within metamodernism is important, because I think that does a lot of conceptual work to frame the suppositions involved here, right? It is something that's progressive in nature, that in a sense God has to die, at least as God was, that there is no going back. There is no kind of reactionary move that will just return us to some, paradisal past or something, but that things move and change and evolve. And sometimes that's messy, sometimes it hurts, but through the process, new things emerge that are genuinely developmental and progressive, that are able to bring to mind and awareness new levels of reality that we hadn't seen before. And that a lot of this process could be interpreted as part of a bigger structure of how the universe itself kind of unfolds. And so I found that very compelling, and that is very much the vision that I'm trying to articulate here.
Sure.
And so just, I guess last thought on that is just, for me, notions of developing the divine, shifting the paradigm, updating our understanding of reality and helping people with the meaning crisis can be understood as a movement through cultural evolution that reaches certain contradictions, dialectical ruptures, right? That we have a map. We can begin to sense that we have a map for navigating these things, and that it leads in a certain direction. And so hopefully that can a little bit tie some of those things together. There's a lot in the mix there. Happy to.
That was quite a good, thorough explanation. I might just echo back to you what I think I heard, and then ask you a question about it. So I think I heard you say that, and the thing I want to ask a question about is whether this is more a description of your motivations and your reasons for being involved in metamodernism, or whether you think this is an appraisal of metamodernism as a phenomenon, or it's something, I guess, over and above you and your engagement with it. I kind of heard you describe metamodernism almost like as either a way to respond or as a response to, kind of like a way of re-enchanting the world, but with an emphasis on not back but through, right? Like not trying to go back to what we had, which, in some sense was primitive. There's a reason we outgrew that, right? But just recognizing that there's something about this swing of the pendulum that's gone a bit too far, and that's kind of, there are consequences of that we're seeing. And then I guess it seems like you're pointing towards metamodernism as like a consolidated set of attempts to overcome that recognition.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of phrasing a lot of that. I mean, yeah, I would say, I guess I'll come back to whether it's me or whether it's broader. But I would say, yes, that there is an attempt to respond to, let's say, the disenchantment with a re-enchantment, but in a way that it's sort of, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? Like once you learn that Santa Claus isn't real, that might be really disappointing. Oh, by the way, sorry, spoiler alert. I don't know who's listening, but once you learn that, right, it's that can be really disillusioning. But I guess the sort of argument that I would say is that is both a necessary disillusionment in the sense that it brings you deeper into alignment with reality, but also those feelings of frustration, anger, disappointment, what have you, are not the terminus of that process, that is a phase in a broader process that is a developmental process, such that you can get on the other side of that and you can see a different kind of enchantment to reality. It's a little hard to use the Santa Claus example, but maybe something like, right, a boy thinks that Santa Claus exists. One day he learns that that's not the case. 15 years later, 30 years later, I don't know what the time would be. They grow up and they have their own family. And now that what had been the boy is a father, and he is in a sense playing Santa Claus, right? By taking a nibble of the cookie or whatever. And that is its own form of magic and enchantment. And in a sense, a much richer, more encompassing one. Or I don't know, a more kind of frequent, more familiar example might be the pains of puberty. No one really enjoys their period of that transformation and all the awkwardness of middle school and all that, right? It's a really sucky time. But I think most people would say it's for the best, right? That what comes on the other side of that is sort of worth those growing pains, literally. And I want to say something similar about, our conceptions of the sacred and the divine and meaning, that yes, that we have kind of progressively outgrown older forms of thinking about these things. And at least my experience of that was profoundly painful, destabilizing, disorienting, vertiginous. But with time, and as you integrate those insights and ideas, you get to the other side of something that's so much richer and more full. And that's the thing that I'm trying to gesture to explain, to think about, to theologize about in some ways. So that's basically the idea, and just kind of a rehashing maybe of what you already said. And in terms of whether it's just me, I don't think it's just me. I mean, I think I wouldn't resonate with this movement so broadly if it didn't have in some kernel form that structure to it fundamentally, right? And I think there are different ways that comes out. There are also, as I've written about in my book on metamodernism, different strands of people talking about metamodernism for whom developmental theories are much more emphasized than others. But even in the folks who are looking at the art or the philosophy, I think that there is if not a deep structure, a continuity and a sort of strand that does make a fabric that ties these things together in some meaningful way. Now, historically speaking, movements may have tenuous threads that connect various aspects of what's moving ahead. Modernity itself, right, was characterized by all sorts of different kinds of philosophies: empiricism, idealism, Kantian, transcendental idealism, various kinds of ways you could be a modernist. But there was also a deeper continuity there to what that general movement meant into what people conceptualized as the Enlightenment. I think something similar is kind of true of metamodernism.
Something that I was thinking about while you were talking, just I guess ruminating on the example you gave of Santa Claus, is I was thinking a little bit about the description you're giving, and part of the reason that I was really excited to have you on is I watched your talk with, I think his name is James, called Critiquing Metamodernism, I think.
Oh yeah, James Cusson,
yeah, great talk. But yeah, something that I was thinking about was you talk a bit about like how to define Metamodernism and I guess its relationship with postmodernism, and you contextualize postmodernism with this this isn't the only thing you link it to, but I'm just focusing in on the thing I think is relevant, with this distrust of grand narratives. And then and I heard you say either in the talk today or in the book, I've got in my head that you have this thought that that there's a kind of a turning back towards a notion of grand narratives. But it makes me think of something to do with the Santa Claus example, which is until you stop blindly believing it, you can't play with the idea. Like you can't decide to consciously believe for the purposes of teaching your child, for example. Like there's a way in which your ability to engage with the idea is limited by your unquestioning belief in it. And when you open yourself up and see it for what it is, that doesn't mean you can't use it anymore. It actually frees you up to engage with it in a more rich way.
100%. And I think that versions of that dynamic characterize pretty much every form of growth, including even kind of classic Freudian notions, right? That aren't necessarily developmental in the kind of constructivist tradition, but something like, until you see your neurosis, you're bound to kind of, live through it. And so a lot of the healing process, and this relates to trauma, I think, as well in its own way, right? It's like, you will live out something until you are able to, in some ways, step back from it to take it as an object of awareness, at which point new things become possible and you gain a new kind of freedom. And that freedom can include playing with things, right, in the way that you're talking about. They can even, and this is probably one of the more controversial approaches to metamodernism, but in some ways it's kind of the oldest, which is some people can just say, yeah, well, that's what I want to do. I want to suspend disbelief, and I want to live in that reality frame, and I know that I'm doing that. And the very fact that you're doing that means you're doing something different than if you didn't know you were doing that. So
it feels.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that kind of reminds me of Aleister Crowley used to talk about kind of putting on these masks and going out into high society and playing these different roles. And I know that the typing systems have been a very big psychoactive for me, and the integral theory has been a big psychoactive, and I imagine metamodernism is also a psychoactive, and this idea of psychoactive feels very relevant here as well. Like there's something that pulls us out of our normal world and shines a light on the things that we're embodying unconsciously.
I think a lot of so it was an interesting sort of Rorschach test, because many people didn't really know what to do with the Hansi Freinacht stuff in the more original forms of metamodernism. Some people were very put off by it, not just because of the ideas, but they were like, I don't understand. He's not actually named Hansi Freinacht, but he's playing with his identity. Like there was just like an inability to appreciate, this move that was being made, which I found kind of ironic. But that was what I think was genuinely, in that original sense, metamodern about Hansi Freinacht's work. Was he was like, look, the fiction is itself a mask that we can choose to put on to reveal deeper realities, right? And so I think that that form of play, that serious play, you could say, is something genuinely progressive, right? Because that, in some ways, stereotyping the kind of classic postmodern move, it's just to say, oh, we're all wearing a mask, everything's fake, everything's an illusion, we're all psychopaths or something, or at the very least, like, there is no depth, there is no mask, we're only the mask, these kinds of things. These were problematizing these kinds of distinctions. But I think once you get that, then you don't just stay there. You're like, oh, okay, yeah, I get that now. Well, what can I do with this? How do I play with this? And it becomes its own new set of methods, of artistic strategies, of philosophical ideas. And in that sense, because it couldn't have occurred before and it needs to have emerged from what's been, there's something, I think, really progressive there. And a lot of my work drawing on other thinkers like Wilber, certainly. I always want to say that now because people are like, Brendan's just saying what Ken Wilber is saying. It's like, okay, I got to give credit to Ken Wilber. Definitely an influence. But certainly beyond Ken Wilber as well. I mean, there's a broad dialectical tradition in philosophy that goes obviously back to Hegel, if not earlier, where these kinds of moves were starting to be, were themselves coming into consciousness, right?
Definitely.
And so anyway, I think that there's something deeply at the core of this metamodern move in appreciating these sorts of progressions in this way.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, this conversation with you has sold me more on the idea than all of my exposure prior to this. Just listening to you, explain it, I think I find it a lot more relatable. And I really resonate with what you're saying about serious play, and I guess to kind of extend the thing I was saying before about, like consciously deciding to play. Specifically, the thing it makes me think about is something that I've been experimenting with for a few years now, which is, telling a story about my life, which is like, the story is like, in a way, it's a fantasy. But it's a fantasy that has meaningful connections with like that actual life path that I want. And it's like, in a way, like in my own private space, I believe in that story in this kind of way where I know it's not really real. You know what I mean? It's not like I really believe it like a child would. But at the same time, I choose to believe it because the narrative structure gives utility to my life, so that participating in it and choosing to engage with it as if it's real, even though I know it's not, empowers me. And I think that's part of what you're pointing towards is this kind of recognition that, okay, a grand narrative, you don't have to like be bewitched by it in order to get the benefits of it. You can kind of hold it at an arm's length and say, I really love this grand narrative. It might not be true, but fuck it, it really helps me to make sense of what's going on though,
Yeah, I think you just described Metamodernism better than I have. So that's great. No, I think that's exactly right. And it does so many things. And again, there's so many aspects to this because, Hansi Freinacht does talk about this dynamic in his work, which is great. But like, again, years before I discovered Hansi, and the reason that I was attracted to Metamodernism pre-Hansi is because it articulated a version of this, the as-if orientation. And what I'd written in the epic poem, for example, that I had explored a lot of these ideas in, basically was an embodied, version of this, so that when I found it articulated theoretically, I was like, oh my God, that's what I've been doing over here. So there's a there to this that transcends any particular lineage in the metamodern discourse. I think that there's something that's that fabric that connects a lot of these different strands. But the other thing I wanted to say is that so the utility of things, well, stop me if I'm maybe going too far into the weeds here. If you want, we can, because I have a lot of thoughts on this phenomenon and the ways that it operates, the ways we see it playing out across metamodern culture, etc. But I also, maybe I don't need to.
I'm excited to hear your thoughts. This idea excites me. So
okay, so a mundane reflection of this in metamodern culture, which has nothing to do with developmental theory, but it's still there. There's been a classic recognition in metamodern cultural studies circles, whatever that means, that the Lego movie is a nice representation of metamodern thought, right? And in that movie, which is, it's a fun kind of kids but also adult movie, there's this prophecy, right? And the whole thing about the prophecy is that it directs this character and it moves him along his path. But then he finds out that the prophecy was all made up, right? And it's like, oh no, disillusionment, right? Oh, I was believing in a lie. But then, things go on, and then, oh wait, well, without the prophecy having been made up, none of this would have happened. So there's the utility aspect there, right? And in fact, that we make real by inaction, right? That, like, in the sense of, if I say it is my fate tomorrow to go into town and buy some milk, right? I've decided this is my story. It's my story. I'm sticking to it. Was that Colin? Anyway, SNL guy. So this is my story. I'm sticking to it. This is my little personal myth, let's say, right? Now, tomorrow I go into town and I buy some milk. Fate realized, prophecy fulfilled, this sort of a thing, right? But there's a tautology here, right? Because it's by living into the story that I've made something real, and without that story, it wouldn't have been real. And so retroactively, we can kind of confirm the deep truths of things by the ways in which we live into the world. And I think that there's actually maybe that sounds trite, but I think when people revisit spirituality, religion through this kind of orientation, they can start to say, especially if they've gone through a period of disillusionment and deconstruction, by living into a story, a richness can emerge out of my life that would not be made possible if I did not live as if this were true. And then what happened for me in a huge way was, if you start living as if some things are true, you can realize they're true, in a way that you never could if you never even just let yourself as if think it were true. Mm-hmm. So I started thinking that spirituality and meaning in general were orientations worth having for the kind of utilitarian reason that we're talking about. So I allowed myself an as if, sort of all right, well, I'm still going to believe this because I think this is the way I ought to go. And it was a sort of radical affirmationist, William James style, choosing to believe. Now, there's no way I could have ended up where I currently am if I hadn't made that initial move, which was sort of a leap of faith in a kind of Kierkegaardian sense, but not even a leap of faith in saying, I think this is real, I have no reason for it, but I'm going to affirm it. It's actually saying, I don't even think this is real, but I still think that I should affirm this, and so I'm going to do this. And so,
the truest leap of faith.
Yeah, in some ways, right? So I guess what I'm getting at, though, is that at least for me, again, personally, that was the necessary shift in mentality that allowed me to be open to new kinds of circumstances and new orientations that have reciprocally opened my whole way of being in the world. And if I'd sat there being like, well, but, it doesn't make sense at this level or whatever, then, you're not going to make those things possible. So there's so much kind of potential for this orientation for people to re-find and reconnect with really profound, significant ways of being in the world. And I think that in some ways, certainly for some people, it can be the crucial link between a nihilism and a full sense of meaning again, right? And I wrote a book on this called Building the Cathedral, which was all about personal myth, right? Because you were talking about the stories and stuff that we live by. And sort of like, it's not true, I guess. And I mean, this is an interesting thing too. Like, things can be or not be true at many sorts of different levels, right? Like, I was just talking to someone recently, and they talked about where they've been recently as an underworld experience, and now they're coming out of the underworld and this sort of thing, right? Well, is that true or not? Well, it's obviously metaphorical. Yeah. On the other hand, someone could say, no, the real story there is that guy's just been a lazy jerk living in his mother's basement for 5 years, and she's finally kicking him out. And now he's telling himself, well, I've been in the underworld, but now I've got to go find my way. It's like, which story is true? Well, there's certainly a more mundane version, but especially if that story that's being told to someone by themselves actually gets them out of an underworld, I think that story is more true. And then this is a life of pi dynamic. Anyway, again, this is what I mean by the going into the weeds, because there's a whole thing here where I
love it. So much of what you just talked about is in the last 5 minutes is gold. Is like, I wish I could touch on every single point. The thing you said about, I can't paraphrase you, but it reminded me of Henry Ford's quote, whether you think you can or you can't, you're right. There is something that seems trite about that, like, it seems very shallow and trivial, but it's strange that it's like it states something profound, but in a way that you can't really access it unless you actually have tried believing something for the sake of seeing where it leads you, that as if frame. And I think, the focus on seeing as if, I think, is really instructive. There's actually a number of books I think are really important for appreciating this dynamic, the role that metaphor plays in thought. I would say metaphor is essential to abstract thought. It actually plays a systematic structural role in how we talk about abstract ideas. And there's a couple of books I would recommend to anyone who is interested in learning more about that. One of them is called Metaphors We Live By. Fantastic book about the systematicity of metaphor. And another one is called The Rule of Metaphor. It's actually about the mechanics, how metaphor actually works, and the various theories on offer in linguistics as to how it works, what it does.
Very cool.
But definitely, I think those are really like learning more about metaphor and about about this actual, like, what's going on cognitively when you see something as,
Yeah.
I think is really important, because there's a real, I think of that as almost like the essence of the power of the imagination is to see something as and act as if it is that.
There's a link as well to like ritual and magic with the K, like these sort of systems of, you know, it's commitment. It's not just sort of pretending that it's real. It's like how much of a theatrical embodiment of this thing, this process that I'm going through, can I really put on and believe wholeheartedly in the moment. And that's the power of it. It's the more I can do that, the more effective it will be.
Well, and there's one thing I'll throw out, by the way, as far as book recommendations too, and I reference this one a lot in the Building the Cathedral book on personal myth, but there's a wonderful book called Living Myth by D. Stevenson Bond. And he describes what we're talking about as symbolic consciousness and gets at these dynamics really, really well as well. Yeah. But I do want to also make a meaningful distinction, which is that this doesn't apply to everything, right? Like I can't say, you know, if it's raining outside, I can't just say, well, I don't want to believe it's raining because I don't want to get wet or what have you, right? And certainly, you know, it's like, oh, I don't want to believe that there's a cliff there. Like we bump up against reality, but there also, there's a layeredness to reality, and there's a deep interpretive aspect to some, you know, many aspects of reality to varying degrees. Now, where interpretation in some ways is paramount, then I think these ideas that we're exploring are really, really salient. Because in some ways, it's kind of a choice. Like, how do we choose to see the world? But some things aren't as amenable to how I choose to see them. I'm either, you know, like, falling off a cliff or not.
You got to have epistemic standards. And I think actually one of the things that marks the difference between, say, like the critical engagement with a fantasy or a story and the uncritical engagement is where the story rubs up against reality. Uncritical engagement just goes with the story. Whereas I think critical engagement involves an awareness of that tension that tries to subordinate the structures of the story to the dictates of reality, basically.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, and I would posit that, you know, philosophers in various ways have explored some of these ideas, but I find these profoundly metamodern in nature. And so, you know, just as there was a whole period of postmodern philosophy exploring some of the key ideas in that paradigm, like these are the questions philosophers, thinkers should be asking, really digging into, performing in their own psychoactive ways, undermining, subverting, all these kinds of things, right? It's a very
that's actually
rich...
one of the things that I'm finding really exciting about this conversation is the realization that actually what I'm doing already does count as metamodernism. Because, like, you know, your description of it, part of the reason that I find that so resonant is I hear that and I'm like, well, I've put into that box then, you know, like that's what I'm doing. And not because I'm looking to metamodernism and kind of going, oh, here's a template and I'm copying that. I just happen to be doing the same thing, which to me, in a way, lends its own kind of credibility to metamodernism, in that independent scholars and thinkers come up with ideas that end up being convergent and resonant in that way without explicitly drawing from the paradigm.
Yeah, well said. Exactly. I mean, if anything, a paradigm, well, and this is the case too with metamodernism very much, is that it's not sort of you cook up a paradigm a priori and then see if you find it in the world. It begins descriptively. You're like seeing things. You're like, how do we account for this? And then you come up with some theories. And that was what the best of the early metamodern theory was doing, was they're like, I'm seeing a bunch of weird art that's not postmodern anymore. You know, what do we call this? But and then like look for patterns there. And a lot of what we're talking about, well, to finish that thought, at a certain point, and I make this point too in the book, that like how we start to theorize these things themselves starts to influence culture, and there starts to be this kind of interesting recursive feedback loop in its own way. Where but what I was going to say is that a lot of what we're talking about is are really best exemplified in a movie like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is, I mentioned that first part first because that's explicitly by those filmmakers described as a metamodern film, and it's all over. The fingerprints of metamodernism are all over that film very much, and I think that there's a similar thing there. Most, I think, potently expressed where Waymond is talking about how, you know, he chooses to see the goodness in the world not because he's naive, right, but because this is what it takes. This is how you fight back against those kind of soul destroying things that otherwise will take you away from all of that. And so when you see that there's a profound pragmatic utility in some interpretations towards reality, there is a kind of almost ontological press to maybe even interpret those things as being more real than the other way, that leads you into nihilism, despair, and maybe suicide and whatever, right?
Yeah, no, I think you put your finger on it before when you kind of pointed out that the very fact that a story works to help someone get themselves out of a situation in a way vindicates it. Of course, it's not to say it's literally true or some simplistic sort of validation, but it certainly seems that if a story works to get you out of a sticky spot, then it's not just fanciful, nonsense. And that seems like a totally illegitimate way of construing it at that point.
Yeah.
I'm reluctant to kind of shift the conversation elsewhere, but I maybe this is a good segue from what we're talking about, but I definitely get the sense that there's a kind of metaphysical assumptions in the background of these, like, stories versus reality. Like a story can be closer to reality if our metaphysical assumptions about reality are such that allows that to be true. And I know that metamodernism sort of has a history in certain metaphysical or non-metaphysical, if we're talking about physicalism, assumptions, at least in terms of metaphysics, as sort of pointing to something sort of foundational reality or whatever that means. And problems with integral theory being, has quite a strong metaphysical background, but then a lot of people trying to bring their own metaphysics, and there's a sort of conflict of metaphysics. And metamodernism seems to be wanting to be almost metaphysically agnostic in some sense, or like more open, kind of like, we don't know yet, so let's let that land in some other way, or like let's look to the experts of like science and established theories. I'm kind of curious where you land in that mess of things.
Well, that's the thing, is I do land very specifically in one orientation. And so I want to highlight that, because I think where I'm at, it's a particular mode of pursuing these topics, and it's not the only mode. And I think people can be doing really fascinating, engagements with metamodern thought that take a very different tack. For me, broadly speaking, I'm a naturalist, and then it's like, well, we start using isms, and what do these terms even mean, and all that. But I think a big move that's important for me is making a clear distinction somehow between the Santa Claus of illusion and this kind of truer story. And in some ways, what I'm about to say might seem to kind of almost kind of contradict in some ways what we've been talking about, but I don't think that's right at all. What I want to say is something like, I think that there are these progressive level insights into reality that build upon themselves, and that a big important key moment of that is getting further insight into the causal nature of how reality works. We can see all sorts of connections when we look outside and see patterns. We know that the brain is really good at that, right? But that doesn't mean that those things exist. It just means that we can be very good at pattern finding. So once you start getting into the kind of rigor of being able to causally connect phenomena in the world and see real cause-effect relationships, then some things no longer are tenable, right? I mean, like, how does Santa Claus get over the entire world in just one night, right? Well, then you have to start making a metaphysics where that's somehow possible, and you get into all this kind of it goes off the rails, right? So at a certain point,
it's reindeer magic.
What's that? Right?
It's reindeer magic.
It's like, well, how do we explain reindeer magic, right? And then so I think that one of the things that scientific inquiry has always kind of directed its attention to, and has helped, I would say, at its best, clarify and elucidate, is that if we don't have a good causal accounting of how certain things are working, then and if at worst, these are contradicting other things that we know about reality, then these are good reasons for maybe throwing out one model and embracing one where we do, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, that's all a roundabout way of just saying that I think that this progression of perspectives leads us deeper into appreciations of kind of causal awareness, how things impact other things, and there's a kind of spectrum there, and it's a developmental spectrum too, because early childhood thought tends to operate in terms of fantasy and just, how does this work? Oh, well, they'll turn on the light bulb and then the sun will go on, or this sort of thing, right? But any of these models, if you take them seriously and you try to probe them from a view of kind of a natural cause and effect, obviously break down. So what I would suggest is metaphysically, as we gain more self-recursive insight, we're able to take more things as objective awareness, and that process unfolds. I think that leads in the direction of greater and greater systemic causal awareness. Now, part of that becomes really meaningful because this is where systems and systems logic show up, right? Where you start this process in like early kind of mechanistic thought of early modernity, of like, oh, when I do this, this happens. There's a clear cause and effect relationship here. We can map that mathematically. We can use that to predict other things, right? And then you get like Newtonian physics, right? Oh, okay, a gravitational body will have this effect. And then we can start predicting where planets will be 10,000 years from now. Well, that's really nice. At the same time, that's 2 planets. Once you have 3 planets in there, then you have the third body problem, and the amount of causal relationships going on is actually now chaotic, and you can't even predict that at all. Now, I mentioned that because what this suggests is that we have, in the early development of modern thought, appreciated, the causal relationships that bear on things, right? But that's relatively sort of a narrow band in which we're able to think in those ways. And one of the great travesties of modernity was overextending that insight. And then, you have people like Laplace saying, well, everything's all predetermined. If we all just knew, the starting points of every atom, then everything in the universe would already be known. But it's not the case at all. The more we start to realize the causal impacts of everything on everything else, we start having to expand our causal awareness even further, to the point where we actually get into mystery again, where we say we cannot know the answer to that. And that's a different kind of not knowing than childhood fantasy, right? Of like, oh, well, they turn the sun on every night. It's like, well, that's one way of like, well, how do they do that? Well, I don't know. He's just a tall giant. Well, where did he come from? Oh, I don't know. Like, there's a kind of not knowing in that direction. But what's interesting about the increase of causal relational awareness is that eventually you get kind of a new level of not knowing on the other side, but it's post naturalistic, mechanistic kinds of insight. So this is a very long, and I'm very sorry, a very long-winded response to this metaphysical question. But I would say that for me, one of the things that I think has been really powerful is to start to situate what we have thought of in terms of a lot of spiritual phenomena and various kinds of ways that people have made meaning in the past, where they've intuited some transcendent kinds of experiences, this sort of a thing, not just in early forms of sort of pre-causal reasoning, but all forms of complex, chaotic, systems level emergent causal phenomena that I think is a new way of conceiving of a lot of the operatory realities of existence, or something like that. So I mention all that because, that's my kind of metaphysical orientation, is that I want to, where possible, really, like, you want to be more scientific than the scientists, right? You want to be more kind of rigorous than the most kind of reductionistic materialist, right? But I believe that on the other side of that, as you bring in more and more features, you get this more and more emergent, complex, enchanted notion of reality. So that's a project that I care a lot about, and trying to articulate what that looks like and how that's progressed developmentally. But other people might see this differently, and they might have different views about what metamodern metaphysics can mean for these sorts of things. So yeah, gosh, there's so much there, and I'm sorry, that was a lot. But
great.
yeah.
And, I know that you're part of the Archdisciplinary Research Center, and that project is all about trying to find the commonalities between theories of everything, and sort of find what they call the arches, which are like these almost like, I mean, it's probably based on the word archetype of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
It's like these fundamental features that sort of have to exist all the way through, almost like this fractality of metaphysical rules or laws. And from what I've heard you describe just before, it sounds like, yeah, maybe like actually, I'll just ask a question rather than positive. I'm curious. Yeah, how does that fit? How does the sense that there's this, these rules, are these rules or laws in these arches like literally there, like in some kind of ontological sense existing in the systems, or like, as just
no,
sorry,
add on to that question as well, because I also have this on my notes, is like, because obviously we did talk to Corey, and so he explained, his approach and stuff. But I guess I'm curious how you would, like, what similarities would you identify, and what differences would you draw, what distinctions would you draw between what metamodernism is and what, I guess, the arch stuff is about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, to both those questions. So maybe starting with that second one first. I think that there's a form of metamodernism which I articulate in my book, and that I see as a kind of synthesis of the different metamodernisms. And it's also very familiar to people who are familiar with Hansi's work, and that the tradition that he emerges out of, that is very dialectical and very integrally informed and all of that. That particularly sees this kind of process underway that is a developmental process. It accretes, it builds on itself. And it's recursive. It builds on what has been before by combining what was before, and that's how you get more complex things, right? You need more parts differentiated, and you integrate them, and now you've got a new whole. And now this is something that can find another thing like itself at similar level of complexity, so on and so forth. But the point is, there's a recursive, transcendent process here by means of which things build up. Now, if we take that architecture and we tie that with what we started out this conversation exploring, which is this move that we can make where we can take something as object, then we can see a basic notion there of what I get at as what do I call it? Recursive transcendence through eternal recursion, or something like that, in the Metamodernism book, which is that I think the way that I try to talk about metamodernism is that this is a basic process that we see happening from, the pre-modern to the modern, whereby the modern reflects on, takes as object, critiques, and then tries to, sort of move beyond the pre-modern. So as to with the postmodern to the modern, and now the metamodern to the postmodern. And progression is defined by the way that it is able to, in a sense, take what was before, objectify it, and then get a bigger frame so that you can see more that's in the picture that frame didn't allow for, which is, I think, a really key, it's a theory of how you can have normativity in perspectives, right? Because if someone believes in Santa Claus and another person doesn't, does a certain perspective there give an adaptive advantage to that person who doesn't, that, say, allows them greater insight into a broader swath of reality? This kind of thing, right? And this is all laid out very well in Piagetian theory and to some degree dialectics and all this stuff. So anyway, that's the basic idea of how metamodernism might conceive of itself as being part of a recursive, transcendent process that builds up things in this way. Now, Archdisciplinarity is basically just the continuation of that process, but beyond metamodernism. And specifically, I think it's the attempt to get a synthesis of the kinds of ideas that emerge only uniquely in certain phases of kind of cultural awareness. So, for example, arguably, sociology is a discipline that has a particular lens, a particular perspectival lens built into it, that is of a particular complexity level. Like, it is getting at the question of ideology formation. Like, that was a big founding notion in sociology. It's like, okay, interesting. People have these ideologies, right? I mean, they're starting to see that dynamic. And of course, Marx had already done a lot to kind of popularize, ideology in some of these ways. And then there's a question, all right, well, but like, do we just have these, or don't we get them from our society, right? So sociology is a study of the socialization processes that require you to have a concept like society, and to see society as constructive of the self and its ideology in some way. It is post-ideological in nature to engage in certain kinds of sociological inquiries. Now, in order to ask those kinds of questions, you need to have come to a particular point, at least in thought, if not in history, where those questions are possible, right? So historically, those questions only kind of start to emerge, in the late 19th century. And when you go back and no matter what place you look for it in, like even Socratic philosophy or antiquity, you can find little glimpses of things here and there. But in terms of like the sociological inquiry, you have to have had other things happen first so that those things can be made objects of awareness, so that you can actually recursively connect them, get a frame outside of them, and see what this looks like. So anyway, this is, I think, similar with Archdisciplinarity. It's sort of like, okay, the kinds of questions that metamodernists are asking and the integralists are asking of like, okay, there's this, grand, kind of theory of everything approach to reality that we're working with here. And we've got our quadrants, or we've got recursive theories of reflective transcendence, or whatever it is that they are. Okay, great. But now that we have those as objects of awareness, how can we get outside of that frame and start to compare versions of those as single sets in a broader context? Because that would actually reveal some new things about reality that we'd never had before we had these categories to even work with. So just as sociology shows up at a particular time in history as requiring a certain necessary set of prerequisites of the ideas that had already emerged up until that time to render it a possible concept of thought, so archdisciplinary modes of inquiry, which are sort of like, okay, presuming all this, what now can we do with that? So that is basically how I would talk about archmodernism, which is what Corey kind of calls this thing, or archdisciplinarity, which is
Can I just quickly reflect that back? Because I'm not 100% sure I'm understanding you. It kind of sounded like you were saying that archdisciplinarity is to metamodernism what sociology is to a particular ideology. Is that right? Because I'm kind of getting the sense that that's not quite what you're saying, but I also can't quite figure out what you are saying.
So there's a couple things that I guess we should parse out here. One is archdisciplinarity versus what Corey calls archmodernism. And so archdisciplinarity is a level of inquiry. Archmodernism is sort of the hypothetical cultural epoch at which that level of inquiry is somehow definitive of the specific cultural products of that epoch or something like that. And so those are two different things. Now, I love archdisciplinarity. I love Corey's work. I personally think that the term archmodernism is probably is not the best term, because it makes people just think, oh, super modernism. And it's like art. No, that's not what that means. But terminology aside, if we presume that something I do think that is the case is that after metamodernism, there will be something else. And what does that look like? Well, we can't really get a sense of that right now because these things haven't happened yet, right? But this is sort of the logic to it right now. So taking everything that we were just talking about, for example, about metamodernism, we defined there a particular structure which we were identifying as occurring across different contexts. So we're like, there's a there to this. Now, hypothetically, whatever that structure is, will have other iterative versions of it potentially, whether that's other contexts where metamodern thought spreads, but then these ideas take on a new form, or just the very kind of, you could say, the structure of the idea, right? So to use a very specific example, we were talking about as if thought producing a certain kind of, lived choosing to believe that produces certain kinds of results, that taking that whole idea, right? There's a kind of structure to that idea, which, as we were talking about earlier, isn't available to like sort of pre-disillusionment mentality, right?
Yeah.
It hasn't yet taken a story as an object of analysis that it's living before it can separate itself from it to see that it was living that story, right? And now that maybe that first begins with a disillusionment, but then gets to this point where we were just discussing of once you've done that and you've gone through all that, then you can eventually do this move of saying, hey, maybe I choose to live into this story and all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So all that follows a structure. Now the idea is, how do we recursively do that again, right?
Yeah.
Make an orthogonal move. Imagine that we basically moved from like the second dimension to the third dimension, right? But now we want to see, can we find a fourth dimension? And I think that is basically one way of talking about archmodernism relative to metamodernism,
So
or you
it's
could
like,
say archdisciplinarity relative to meta theory, something like that.
okay. So you would say that archmodernism is like uh, an attempt to anticipate what the next stage is going to be.
Yeah, I think archmodernism is a placeholder because we're talking about a cultural historical epoch that
Yeah.
has not occurred yet.
Okay.
And metamodernism is still contested, right? So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it is a concept born out of an idea, or I should say, it's a concept born out of a logic that I think is very sound. In the same way that so it's almost like it's a prediction.
It's
you
a
could almost
projection,
say.
yes. It's an
Yeah.
extrapolation.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, so once you see that, chemical X makes chemical Y and that there's a particular pattern to how this unfolds, you can hypothesize there will be a
Yeah.
chemical Z and, or Z, and that sort of a way. So, but it is presuming then that there is a deep logic to the nature of cultural logics, right? Which is what, I kind of talk about.
Well, I think in particular, the thing it seems to presume that at least I would maybe call into question is that the way that the next subversion happens is relying on, I guess, something that we already have a grasp of now. When it seems totally plausible that the next subversion will be, originating from a place we haven't paid attention to yet.
Totally. So. Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, I think that's a very valid insight. And, I wonder what Corey would say to that. For my part, I find archdisciplinarity a wonderful and really important line of inquiry, and I'm working in that space. But the bulk of my work is dedicated to this particular moment that we're in and trying to attend to it and its particular needs. But they are deeply related, right? Because the more you do that kind of work, the more you start to anticipate and get a sense for, these other things. But I love your point, and I think it's right. It almost wouldn't be orthogonal to what we've been doing if it wasn't totally out of the blue, in some way. Yeah.
No, I think that's right. Man, I'm loving the conversation today. Hopefully, I would love for us to be able to continue it, because I know we're getting close to the time limit today. But like I've had at least a half a dozen times during this conversation, I've had goosebumps while I've been listening, and for me, that's I take that as the touch of meaning. That's really. I don't trivialize that. To me, that's like a kind of a recognition on a level deeper than my conscious mind that this is important and that I should attend to this. So, yeah.
Well, awesome. I'm really glad to hear that. I mean, yes, I've got a little bit more time, but I agree. This has been awesome, and I feel like there probably are a number of things that maybe you wanted to get into. We haven't had the opportunity to.
That's the thing is I've got. Apart from my notes that I prepared, I've written down an additional sort of 10 points or something that we just don't have time to get into, but I would love to explore.
I would too. Well, let's do another, but also I probably have time for like one more subject that we could kind of tackle if you want to pick something off the list or something.
Yeah. Well, do you have anything, Alexander?
I feel like I've been bringing most of the subjects. Please, let's go to your list.
Yeah. All right, let's see. All right, maybe I could ask, because obviously some of your recent work is like focused around spirituality and meaning, and I guess two-part question: what does spirituality mean to you? And second part of the question is, how do you relate to synchronicity? Is that something that plays a role in how you in your relationship with, say, spirituality and meaning, or
interesting. So I have a pretty broad conception of meaning. Spirituality, which is more related to meaning. I would say spirituality is sort of a category that pertains to ways of being in the world that have a sort of grounding function for individuals, that tie them to the cosmos in a way that makes them feel homed in the cosmos. Something like that. I could dance around that a lot more. Part of why I started using the word spiritual is because there seemed to be a resonance there for good reason that in our culture, there'd be a move away from religion. There was a sense of religion being organized religion, it being kind of dogmatic and impositional, and spirituality was more sort of free and open and sort of had more of this kind of airy, exploratory quality to it. And I think that there was a kind of semantic richness there, partly because of its ambiguity that afforded certain things. That said, there are certain things I don't see spirituality as being about. Well, actually, let me back up. I also see spirituality as being developmental and evolutionary, and that because of that dynamic that I was just talking about, this way that people feel homed, that they feel a sense of meaning and connection, all these kinds of things, that orientation towards being, I think, can undergo structural changes, including, and most of my current work at the moment is exploring how that looks across the lifespan as people actually go through ontogenetic development, and exploring models, like ego development models, but particularly and specifically James Fowler's models of faith development, which are really kind of structures of meaning as they evolve through complexity. So anyway, just to acknowledge that that can be and is, I think, a developmental process that content-wise takes different form at different sort of stages. Now, the stage that I'm interested in, and what I'm interested in, is sort of metamodern spirituality, is a particular part in that process of the complexification of spiritual orientations towards reality that have a particular structure to them, a kind of complexity, a particular kind of feeling, orientation, vibe, sensibility, and associated content, I guess, as well. So, because one of the things I was about to say before I stopped myself was I was going to say spirituality, what I don't mean by it is something like there are spirits and we relate to these spirits. And this is I would say, a moment in the development of spirituality, in intimations of meaning, that I think is part of that developmental process. So that's not what I mean by spirituality. We can hold off on the metaphysical question of, are there spirits, and if there are, what might they mean? But when I talk about spirituality, it's not, yes, communing with the spirits. It's more like the question of, what is meaningful in my life? Do I have a sense of meaning? Am I in despair? All these kinds of things. So it's broadly speaking that. And I would also add that I like Layman Pascal's description of this a lot, and it's really influenced my thinking. And if you haven't talked to Layman, you guys should definitely talk to Layman. So Layman uses this model he calls the surplus cohesion model of religion and spirituality, and his notion is that that there is sort of an individual and collective version of a singular phenomenon, which is a kind of process where subparts, when they come together effectively and they kind of synergize, they produce a kind of fullness or a richness that kind of overflows, and we experience this as a kind of potency. Now, that might sound really vague, but it's really very simple. It's sort of like, imagine those times where you felt just like all of your parts are working in sync, and you're just
flow.
In the flow state. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You're able to do things you're not able to do usually. You're just on, there's a fullness there, and it comes from just feeling totally synced up with all of your parts working in concert. Now, this can also happen at the collective level, and that's where it's called religion. So when you get a bunch of individual people interacting in a similar way to how your individual subparts sync up, but they're doing it collectively, then you get a kind of surplus potency, and that this is sort of the basis of religiosity in culture. And when that's working really well, when it's true, genuine religion, then you get, this emergent spirit that flows up and out of a people to do these big things like build cathedrals and, go to the moon or whatever, right? And that also is developmental, that the content and the structure of that will vary depending on its complexity level, but that there's an underlying mechanic. So I like that. I like that there's an collective religion and individual spirituality, and that these are kind of individual collective forms of the same thing, because fundamentally we're gesturing to those modes of existence in which something is brought out of you or emerges forth from you through the collective syncing up and harmonization, a kind of hyper super harmonization of your parts to generate novel phenomena. That, I think, is how I would best articulate spirituality.
Beautiful.
There was another question in there too, though, related to that.
There was, but actually, I'll just put a pin in that question for a sec, because I
Okay.
had something to share in response that, you know, was brought to mind by what you're saying. It's actually a quote from, well, it's a quote I use in an essay I wrote from a guy called Pierre Hadot. I don't know if that's how you say his last name. And the book it's from is called Philosophy as a Way of Life. So I'm just going to read the quote, and then the quote's right at the end of the essay. So I'm just also going to read the concluding 2 sentences after the quote. We may get some idea of the change in perspective that may occur in our reading and interpretation of the philosophical works of antiquity when we consider them from the point of view of the practice of spiritual exercises. Philosophy then appears in its original aspect, not as a theoretical construct, but as a method for training people to live and to look at the world in a new way. It is an attempt to transform mankind. So that's the quote, and then the it's just one sentence actually. Afterwards goes, living philosophy, which is true philosophy, is an embodied spiritual practice that entails a way of being rooted in the world, and therefore implies a mode of relationship with the great mystery which one follows through on and manifestly inhabits.
Amen.
Yeah, and that's, I feel like that's a really great expression of what you were talking about in terms of spirituality, in terms of feeling at home and having that sense of connectedness and relationality with the greater of which you are a part, and that attempt to sync up with that and harmonize with it. I think that's spot on.
Yeah, no, well said. And I would draw in some Vervaeke here too, because I think what John Vervaeke has gotten into with his explorations of wisdom is very analogous to this, right? It's sort of like, what are your orienting modes that lead to a reciprocal opening, right? And once you start identifying the mechanics of that, you do identify the mechanics of flow, right? And you also get into awe and wonder and the things that we associate with coming into a new level of awareness of reality, of something's being disclosed or opened up to us in a new way. And this is what my book is all about in many ways, about the learning process, because I see that fundamentally as being the learning of a new. We've encountered a level of chaos that is outside of our kind of paradigm, but we're somehow syncing up with it and taking it in and seeing its utility and value. And this it's empowering to us, and it is also it is consequent. You know, what would you say? It's coincident with experiences of awe and wonder and a sense of insight. And this, to me, is, I think, this deep process. Speaking of what ties us to the universe, I think this is a process that goes really all the way down. And fundamentally, or maybe most expansively, these kinds of moments of insight are also those in which we see that, in a sense, we are the universe gaining deeper insight about itself. So that's a big part of.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. And that actually leads us really neatly to the second part of my question, which was about synchronicity. Because actually, while you were talking about spirituality, I was thinking to myself that part of what you're describing, that the you called it like when the group collective comes together and they individually sync up in a way, and then there's that surplus energy. You said, you know, that's religion or religiosity or spirituality, and true, but the phenomenological quality of that, I call that resonance. You know, that feeling of coming together with people and having that where, and it's happening in this conversation, you know, where there's a feeling of like we're touching things that individually we're dimly aware of, we know about, you know, but there's a level of access that is made possible by that collaborative syncing up that, you know, is
and I just got the chills too. And like, that's the thing. I think that deep intuition of meaning, like that's what that is, you know, it's like, that's that little mini collective effervescence kind of bubbling up in
exactly.
And again, you know, speaking of Vervaeke, I think when, you know, the word dialogos has become kind of, you know, I don't know, just made to mean everything at this point. But I think what he originally meant by that was that what you're talking about, right? Where when people come together and something emerges out of the collection that wasn't in sort of the parts before, but it was able to be drawn out or evoked by means of interaction. That's a very special and beautiful, wonderful thing. And
that's something he talks about very lucidly, you know, and I think one of the quotes that he uses frequently to describe it, and this is, I think, a quintessential expression of it, which is when two or three gather in my name, there I am.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. So real quick, just on the question of synchronicity, I mean, I think we've hit all the really powerful parts, and I think that Jung, I think as I understand, had quite a sort of metaphysics built up of how he was understanding what these synchronicities are, which I can't speak to in the full depth, because I'd have to at least read Bernardo Kastrup's book, because I apparently understand Jung was something of an idealist in maybe some ways. So there's something to that would need to be. So I don't want to touch on it on that point, but I do find moments of resonance, certainly in my life, and unexpected resonance that do seem to be suggestive of, let's say, bigger patterns at play, right? That
Okay, cool, yeah.
And I think that maybe that's a very loose way of talking about something where that is actually not too hard to naturalize in any kind of destructive way, but like we are playing out patterns we do not see all the time, right?
Yeah.
And when we bump up against something that would seem too orderly to be random, which it is, we're experiencing a kind of pattern that we're sort of like, oh, that's really weird, but of course at the same time, and something's going on here. And then it's a fascinating line and level of inquiry of how we could start to study those patterns better.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. That part of the reason I ask is actually that's part of my work. I've spent a few years now. I learned about synchronicity from someone who had spent 20 or 30 years studying it, not in an academic reading sense, although that too, but studying it in the sense of, in a first person, like, how, can I apply these ideas? What happens if I believe them? And that. Yeah, and I think that's very fruitful when it comes to synchronicity, and I've continued that work since I stopped working with him over the past 3 or 4 years. So I'd love, I feel like there's a lot of potential, fertile ground there for a future conversation, because I'd love to get into a bit more of the details there.
And real quick, I just want to say, I was talking recently with someone the other week, and they were saying that they have a synchronicity calendar. And I said, what's that? And what they said was that they experienced enough synchronicities that they started tracking them. And I thought, this is a lovely idea. Whatever we make of whatever this phenomenon is, we need a science of synchronicity, right? So start tracking these things, start looking for patterns to the patterns. That's just the there you go. Great.
Yeah, so this is my synchronicity journal, where every time something odd happens to me, because, you can't really always tell what it means when it happens. You're just like, that's weird, So I just made, part of when I started working with Mystic, which was the guy who told me about it, this is what I started to do, is I started, like with dreams, if you're trying to understand, your psychology better, you just start writing them down. Similarly with synchronicity, and being able to go back over them and see things that, because it's multiple parts. There's some of those things would have got forgotten, you know what I mean? But more importantly, and I think this is the thing that people underestimate, is those memories would have been altered by me retrospectively as I learn more about what happened, So being able to record them in the original form and say, this is the phenomenology that I experienced, and have that recorded in a way that my continual self-narrativization cannot modify, gives you a level of objectivity with the phenomenon that I think is really important.
Yeah, I love that. And I think if more people were doing that kind of study and research into these things, we'd start to, move it from, that felt interesting, but moving on now to, an actual study of some kind of scientific quality. And I guess maybe just one last thing I'll say on that front. It's a great example, I would say, of the kinds of phenomena that do fall into the category of, in a sense, what is the better story, right? Like, no one can prove to you that you could lay out all these synchronicities and either that they are or are not in some way meaningful, right? But like, there's different ways of reading that and interpreting that. And so long as one isn't necessarily using this as like the basis for, kind of, I don't know, a kind of aleatory, divinization process that's maybe they're going to, sort of reject any kind of rational decision-making process and leave it all up to synchronicity or something, that would probably be maladaptive. But if it's a life-enhancing story, all the more so in some ways. I don't know. So I'm just trying to tie that back in because,
I think it's the sort of thing you have to hold lightly. And you know, I would love to get further into the details. Obviously, we don't have time today. But one of the things I'd love to do in that context is share a couple of my stories around synchronicity, because I think what we were talking about before, in the sense of, you know, say a story that gets you unstuck. I have two examples of that where the quality of getting unstuck and the way that the synchronicity is tied up with the finding of that information that gets you unstuck serves. I've always thought that the capacity of synchronicity to affect healing vindicates it in a way that no talking ever could.
That's really fascinating. I'd love to talk about that. I can share a story of my own that specifically I rejected the story that was coming through as the healing story. And we could discuss for good or ill, I don't know, but it was just interesting, a profound synchronicity that seemed to all be leading to this new way of looking, and then thinking back, that was probably just chance, you know? And then
I think that's actually important and a healthy part of the process, and that whole discussion around and the whole the thinking something could be meaningful and being willing to hold it lightly and say, I'm not going to project closure. I'm going to say that could be something, might not be. We'll put it to the side and I'll make up my mind later. And I don't have to feel ridiculous for having thought that maybe it was something, you know.
Sure.
I think there's something very mature about that. And that's really important, I think, for engaging with parts of the world that are more subtle, that aren't as, say, easily accessible to third-person descriptions. And I think the most important parts of what it is to be a subjective living creature are aspects of the world that you cannot convey to someone else unless they've already had those experiences. And so there's no chance of you learning it from a book, you know.
One last actual last thing to say on that front is you brought up the subtle, and for people watching this and they're interested in all these things we've been talking about in metamodern spirituality, and I mentioned layman already, we do these metamodern spirituality labs at Sky Meadow. And the one happening in the spring, in like 9 weeks from now, it's happening May 16th through the 18th, and then you can come early. The topic that we're going to be exploring is metamodern perspectives on the subtle. And I think that everything we're talking about really would be some fascinating, stuff to chew on in that context. So anyway,
it might be really cool to get both Layman and yourself on to talk more about these topics then, and
that'd be great.
Frame them in different ways.
I think we already were planning on getting Layman on. I think he's on our list.
Definitely. Well, he's a show unto himself. So, you know, I would suggest also, just no matter what, talk to him one-on-one or trio logos.
It would probably be smart to have him on one-on-one first before we do a joint talk.
Absolute pleasure. Brendan, really, really, really big pleasure. Feeling really juicy. Like there's so much more to talk about. I've been kind of quiet the last little bit, but I've been really feeling like the conversation. I've got lots to share about that, and next time.
Absolutely. I mean, apart from, I've loved the conversation. Really great subjects. I mean, it's actually, if I wasn't feeling good about getting up early and you know, but actually it's a great way to start my day, because the conversations like this turn me on, not obviously in a sexual sense, in an intellectual sense. Like I feel charged up, I feel activated, like, you know, like I've got
that's that collective
battery.
Effervescence. That's what I'm talking about. There it is. Emergent.
But
no, this has been delightful. I just want to say this has been really wonderful. I've really been a delightful flow, and I've been really enjoying the kind of stuff we've been able to cover. So thanks so much for the invite. This is great.
And just for my part, I have really enjoyed talking with you. Brendan, I feel like you're very thoughtful, erudite, extremely articulate. It's nice, actually, to be able to talk to someone who it feels like is making me scramble a little bit to keep up. That's not a phenomenon that happens to me very often, so it's cool.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. Well, let's do a part 2, because it sounds like there's so much we have yet to get into, and would love to continue the conversation. So we can plan that and put that on the calendar. Look forward to it.
Absolutely.
Cool.
All right, thanks guys. I'll stop the recording now.
Sounds good.